Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. I think I've got all the runner beans that there are left to pick. And now we're in November, there aren't going to be any more. So I might as well harvest these and dismantle the beans, which have done well this summer. But you can see they've been touched by frost along here and they're not frost hardy. So what I'm doing is dismantling the framework, and of course the beans themselves, the growth, goes on the compost heap. This is all part of the gentle and slow process of settling the garden down for winter. So obviously things like the runner beans get taken down, but in the borders, almost every day we go through just taking down anything that's clearly finished, taking out plants that either need protection or have died back completely. And we do find that a lot of plants just get sodden and they look miserable. And so it's best to cut them back. So by Christmas, the garden is reduced by 3/4. And you just have the bones, which I think still look good. But then the garden is not so much finished as ready for what's to come next year. Now, coming up on today's programme. Arit explores a nursery in East Sussex where an array of grasses and perennials takes centre stage in their display garden.
I think sometimes people can overlook grasses, especially if border space is tight.
I'm passionate about the grasses. There's such a range of them. They're not just a foil sometimes, they're the star of the show.
Sue visits a garden in Devon that has been radically transformed by landscaping it to create a whole new range of conditions for the plants.
So this is a lower horseshoe-shaped mound, and it's like a sweet shop mix of all my new favourites, all the peaches and the pinks and the yellows all together.
It's rather bold and beautiful, isn't it?
We go to a community garden in central London, where the local residents can get together as they hone their gardening skills.
We've got this really long border over here. So this week, I'm thinking we replant it freshly with some new shade-loving plants so we can get some colour and some variety into this part of the garden.
And I'll be planting a hawthorn hedge in the orchard. Part of the process of accepting winter and preparing for it is dealing with our dahlias. Now, we grow a lot of dahlias here at Longmeadow, and they've done really well this year. But you can see they've also been touched by frost. But it hasn't killed them. It's just killed the top of the foliage. If about half of it gets blackened, then you either dig them up and store them, or you leave them in the ground. Now, here at Longmeadow, where we have wet and cold simultaneously with our heavy clay, we found that if we leave dahlias in the ground, at least half of them will rot. However, we made the raised beds last winter and we filled them with lots and lots of drainage material. So what I'm going to do as an experiment this year, because we've got these raised beds and good drainage, I'm going to leave these ones in the ground and I'm going to dig these ones up. So I'm going to start with these now. The first thing to do is to cut them back. And we'll put that in there. Having reduced them to just a few stumps, just lever in underneath them and lift like that. And if you hold them by the stem and gently take off as much of the soil as you can, without breaking up the clump of tubers. And being gentle is the art. Pop that in there. Right. I'm going to process these before I come back and do the rest. Come on. Good boy. You can do this job indoors, but it's much easier and better to do it outside. This, to me, is a job for a dry day in autumn. Now, the first thing to do is take out your tubers and go back to getting as much soil off as possible. It's a lot easier to do it at a table here than from the bed itself. The next stage is to wash them. Now, having cleaned it, I can see. What I'm really looking for above all is to make sure there are no slugs in there, because if you trap a slug and you come and check it out in March and it's eaten its way through half of them, I don't think there are any slugs in there. There's a little bit of damage there, but you see, if I feel that, it's really firm. It's not rotten, but that's okay, so I don't need to take it off. If that was squidgy, then I should cut that off with a knife. I don't want to store any of the rotten tubers. Once you've checked it over and you're happy with it, turn it upside down and leave it for 24 hours. That will dry off most of the water and also drain any liquid that is in the stems. Having dried it out, you need to store them. Now, dahlias ideally are stored somewhere that is frost-free, dark, cool, and slightly damp, or at least humid. So if you've got somewhere like a garage, that's ideal. And you don't just put them in loose like that. They do need to be protected in some way, both to stop them drying out and stop them getting too wet. You can use spent compost, that works perfectly well. You can use vermiculite or perlite or sand. But what we found works best of all for us is newspaper. Now, I'm someone who likes to read my news in a hard copy, and it's very tricky to wrap dahlias in your tablet or whatever appliance you use. But if you have it, it's a very good way of recycling them. Just pop the tubers in the middle like that, wrap them around, keeping the stems clear. If you haven't got newspapers, a paper bag will do very well too, but not a polythene bag. You want something that can breathe. Now, Arit went to visit the nursery of Marchant's hardy plants in East Sussex, where they have a garden that looks superb at this time of year.
When the vibrancy of high summer planting has become a distant memory and there's a chill in the air and everything has started to fade, including the light levels, you know that autumn is in full swing. But it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. A few key perennial plants can carry colour, texture and interest throughout these chilly months to add some much needed vibrancy. I've come to meet Henry Macaulay, head gardener at one of the very few nurseries in the country that propagate and grow all their own plants and pride themselves on all year round displays. Henry, this place is absolutely amazing. What is the ethos behind what you do here?
Well, the ethos here is that we are as natural as possible, but particularly this garden, this is actually a giant stock bed. We have 1,500 types of plants in the garden, and we use them to create our plants we're propagating for the nursery.
Right.
So we don't buy them in, so we have a biosecurity, almost ring fence around us. And we've got garden on organic principles. It's laid out artistically to create a beautiful display garden, which people can see the plants in situ, how they grow, and actually how they perform.
The border looks fantastic. I mean, certainly at this time of year, but how do you keep that seasonality going and deciding what to keep at this time?
As you can see, we like to leave as much as we can, partly because it's just environmentally sensitive. These are all wildlife habitats for all sorts of microbeasts. But even aesthetically, you can see here the tops of the verbena has started. They're really structural, and that brown gives an element to the garden. And you have to be selective, work out what you're going to cut down. Some things will go a bit mushy. But actually, if you just look carefully, use your eye, and try to keep most plants, you'll get a beautiful vista of different tones of browns and ochres and different colours.
I noticed that your borders are quite banked up Is that because of the type of soil that you're on?
It's on quite tough Wealden clay. It's hard to work in the winter. In the summer when it's very dry, we get lots of cracks, like the Grand Canyon sometimes, but we make sure that they are mounded up as hills, so there's a bit of drainage sometimes, and it means the plants can do particularly well.
Robust and looking grand are the glorious grasses. Perfect for autumn interest, they add drama and texture. Henry, I think sometimes people can overlook grasses, especially if border space is tight. What would you say to that?
I'm passionate about the grasses. There's such a range of them. Later in the year, they really shine, and grasses are tough plants. They're really resilient. They're not just a foil sometimes, they're the star of the show. You get grasses that stand up almost all winter, and people often think they should be at the back. Sometimes you should put them right at the front of the border, make them the diva, make them the star sometimes. We've got about 30 different types of miscanthus in the garden alone. And later in the year, in November particularly, I didn't used to be a fan of miscanthus. Come November, the light, morning and evening, captures those grasses. Yeah. They are beautiful, and I can't recommend grasses strongly enough.
There's a grass for every garden, is what you're telling me.
Absolutely. I really wanted to show you this part of the garden because this is where some grasses really come into their own.
OK.
We've got a Millennia Hyderbrow here, which is just turning gold, looking really, really good. But behind it, we've got a Cynthia trichum, and you can just see how that gold in the plant picks up on both the gold in the centre of these, which have been pollinated, and the ones which are just going over and have been already pollinated too. And also this Pennisetum Black Beauty, which is simply a gorgeous plant. I mean, look at those seed heads, and look how they sparkle. You almost want to roll in. It's just lovely. And it looks brilliant in the morning, in the middle of the day, and in the evening too, and it captures that light fantastically.
When would you divide this? When would you kind of split this?
We divide it either in the spring or the autumn. We'd get a couple of garden forks, put it back to back and pull them apart. Often you end up with a kind of donut centre, and that's a key point. If you start to see your grasses form a little gap in the middle, that's the time to divide them.
There are still some plants really pumping out fabulous flower colour at this time of year, and Bistorta taurus is one of them. I mean, that is such a fantastic colour to be seen in the garden. But what's really caught my eye is this Helianthus augealis. It's towering over me, yet still pumping out vibrant, bright yellow flowers, and it's absolutely fantastic. Henry, I know the site is for sale, so do you know what the future's looking like?
Well, although the future is uncertain, and the ethos of our nursery, that sustainability, the way we run the stock garden, will live on. It's inspired many other nurseries to work this way, so we're extremely proud that, yeah, that legacy will be very long-lasting.
Well, there has been fantastic work done here. I mean, and it is inspiring. I've taken away lots, so all I can say is well done and good luck for the future.
Thank you, Arit.
I think you can see from that grasses do look fantastic. I love them. And we have quite a few here in the grass borders at Longmeadow. And they start to really perform at their best from late summer onwards, and they get better and better. And by Christmas time, when there's practically nothing else going on in the garden, they are still looking good. And although they can have a bit of a low period when you cut them all back in early spring, they are no trouble at all. It takes a day to cut it down, clear up what you've cut, maybe mulch it, but I only do that every 2 or 3 years, and that's it. We just leave it alone and let it perform, which it does in spades. And if you've not grown grasses before, I would recommend miscanthus. There are lots of different types, from silver feather to the giant sacchariflorus. We've got zebrinus in there with stripes. And the great thing about miscanthus is they're tough and they're adaptable. Grasses, I think, are essential for any garden. I'm going to prune this rose, which is a job that I really look forward to. This is a climbing rose. It's called Madame Alfred Carrière. I've had it here for about 12 years and it's very vigorous, but I know that pruning climbing roses can be a bit daunting if you're not quite sure what you should be doing. The first thing to be aware of is the difference between a climbing rose and a rambling rose. Climbing roses produce their flowers on new shoots that develop in spring, whereas rambling roses produce their flowers on old shoots that were produced the previous summer. So if this was a rambler and I pruned it now, there'll be no flowers next year. The time to prune ramblers is after they finish flowering, usually about July or early August. Now this is definitely a climber. So the first thing to do is to remove all the excess growth that's grown this year, get back to a framework and set it up so when it starts to grow next year, it'll be in good shape to carry those new shoots, which in turn will carry the flowers. You can see at this stage, I'm not worrying too much about where I'm cutting it. In an ideal world, you cut just above a bud. So I'm removing all these side shoots. I've got stems that are all crossing each other. And you want to try and avoid that as much as possible because they will rub against each other and form wounds and calluses, and that's where you can get problems. So this one can come out. Quite a woody, hard stem, that. One of the things, ideally, when you're pruning climbing roses, is to renew it with 1 or 2 new stems every year. So over about 5 to 10 years, you totally renew the rose, and that keeps it vibrant and keeps it fresh. That is 1 year's growth. That has grown since April and probably finished growing around about August. And if you don't prune it, it becomes an impenetrable tangle, and then that makes pruning really tricky. You can see that I'm beginning to get a structure. You can see the basic bones. It's not quite finished yet. I need to tie everything in securely. That's really important because you don't want anything loose that will flap about in winter storms. Tidy it all up. I won't be able to put this on the compost heap because of the thorns, so I will actually burn all this and then keep the ash and put the ash on the compost heap, and then the job's done. I don't have to do anything else at all except enjoy the flowers when I know that they will reappear at the end of next May. We're off now to Earl's Court in London to join a thriving community project.
When I tell people that I'm a professional gardener in London, they're usually quite surprised. They don't necessarily associate cities with beautiful plants and gardens, but if you look closely, you can find green spaces tucked away in the most unlikely places. My name's Hafsa Havaji. I've been a gardener here at Aysgill Community Hub for around 2 years now. It's a space in the Earl's Court area of West London. This is a garden that's managed by the Hammersmith Community Garden Association, and it's also managed by the Earl's Court Development Company, alongside a lovely group of volunteers. It's smack bang in the middle of like a construction site, basically. So you can hear behind us lots of drilling. We're also on the path of the planes getting to Heathrow, so it's very urban. We get lots of people that pass through this space to use the activities in the hub. And as they pass through, they get to enjoy the garden, especially on a wonderful day like this. The planting here is very ornamental. So we've got lots of nandina, lots of big shrubs. These birch trees are really beautiful. They add really great structure to the garden. And then, yeah, along the side, there's just lots of hedging. We've got a big bay tree over there. And then also more perennials, more flowering plants, which are more diverse and attract a wider range of insects and wildlife. 90% of the volunteers who come here have no previous gardening experience. They have come with the intention of learning from sowing seed to propagating things, the whole process. So it's a really exciting journey to take them on. One of the first things we're doing today is we've got this really long border over here. So this week, I'm thinking we replant it freshly with some new shade-loving plants so we can get some colour and some variety into this part of the garden. Ferns are really good for shady borders. They do really well. We've got some heuchera, the carex over here. It's easier just to hold all of its hair up, put them in, press them down like that. That's good to go.
I'm Shirley and I've been coming along to the garden since it started, which is a couple of years. I don't have a garden, but I live on the 6th floor, but what I do have is lots of house plants. The thing that I'm most proud of here is the comfrey plant, because I was actually gifted that and I didn't have anywhere to plant it. I was told it was an outside plant, so I thought, okay, I'll bring it here and plant it here. It came as a tiny little thing like that, and it's just like, wow, enormous now.
Tommy Lane, I've actually not been coming that long. I retired in March. Life went a bit quiet, and I thought, oh, I'm sort of missing interaction with other people. And I just thought, actually, that would be a really nice thing to do, just to come, you know, just be able to part of a community garden. They're just such a nice group. I just love it. I just look forward to it every week.
One thing I'm really proud of in this garden is our veg bed. It was actually destined to become a lawn, but when we started, I made sure that it was saved and used as a vegetable area because I recognise that a lot of the people in this local community don't have their own gardens. We have some lovely chard. Nasturtiums are doing really well. Last year, lettuces did really well in this bed, but this year we've really struggled. Just lots of snails, and the seedlings don't make it very far. So that's something we've taken away from this year's growing season. My heritage is Indian, and I come from a family of farmers. Like my uncles were farmers in India, my granddad was. So when I said I wanted to pursue horticulture, my parents were a little bit confused. For them, it felt like I was going backwards in a way. I had a little bit of an interest in law, so they kind of encouraged me to pursue that first, which I did. Very quickly realised it wasn't for me. So then I signed up for a degree at a university in horticulture. I'm able to use those skills I learn every single day and teach them to people too, which I think is amazing.
Bit of garlic. Ta-da! My name's Leroy Douglas. I've been coming to the garden, to the community hub for about a month and a half. Well, I was going through a little bit of stress and depression and stuff, and then I went to the doctors to try and get some help and stuff, and then they've helped me to come to the garden community hub, and now, sort of, I'm doing a little more better. I like helping. It builds my confidence, being able to be a little bit more sociable with people. I can relax. I haven't got skills to God, but this is why I'm learning my skills and stuff. So then I've learned, so now I'm a lawnmower.
My name's Floyd. I've been gardening here since last summer. The enjoyment I get from gardening has just been surprisingly overwhelming. It's something that I enjoy immensely. But when I come through the gates, it's just really amazingly calm, and I leave the world behind, and it's just me and the plants here in the garden, and I just really enjoy being in the space. Hafsa is amazing. She has the calm, quiet, tranquil enthusiasm that is infectious, and you learn so much from her, almost by osmosis. It's just been so rewarding having her here and learning from her.
I feel very lucky to be able to do this work and very lucky to be able to share that passion with people and support people in their journey into gardening as well. When my parents see what I'm doing now and the variety of things I'm doing now and where I'm sharing my work, I think they're very glad that I was very headstrong and followed my passion and what I wanted to do.
There is just no doubt about it that that kind of project improves the quality of people's lives. It makes life better for everybody. So all you can hope is that more and more of them appear. Now you can see the courgettes have got frosted. It's time to collect them in. But the actual courgettes themselves are still good. This is Tromboncino. And it's about the oddest courgette you can possibly grow. Not only do they look distinctly like comedy vegetables, but also, unlike most courgettes, which have soft skins, these have now got hard skins, and they're enormous. But they will keep, and they are edible. Look at that. And it's really heavy. Well, it looks like we'll be eating Tromboncino for a while, but I think just for the decorative value, they're fantastic. Now, still to come on today's programme. Sue visits a gardener in Devon who is inspired to transform her back garden to create a glorious, colourful theatre of plants.
I love the colour scheme in here. It's very, very calming.
I think I'm a bit of a painter stuck inside a garden. There's not time for everything, so I paint with my plants.
And we delve into the fascinating micro-world of moss.
We have glittering wood, which is one of my personal favorites. The colors vary from dark green when the moss is kept in the shade, and when you give it a wee bit of sun, it changes the color to this flamey orange.
I've decided to plant a hedge here, running along the back of the orchard, but not so tall as to obscure the view, where we've got used soil that we dump, some logs, the bits and pieces of a garden that every garden needs, but not necessarily in full view. Now, I've chosen hawthorn, and it's bare root. Now, bare root means that they've been grown in soil, so you make the order, they're dug up, sent out the same day, and then when they come, you need to do something about them immediately. You either need to heel them in, which means just simply covering the roots with soil, or you need to give them a drink for half an hour or so, and then cover them up. And as you plant them, you must never let the roots be exposed for more than a few minutes, because these very fine filigree roots are the feeding roots, and they dry out and then die. So what I've got here is some hessian, and this is a really good trick. If you've got bare root plants, get yourself some hessian and just damp it down. And that gives you a wet cloth to put over the roots as they're ready to be planted. There we go. So I've got a damp cloth that I can lay over them, and it feels really wet and cold. Now, the plants themselves. If you're planting very small plants, if you have a bucket of water, you can put 10 or even 20 in the bucket and just take them out as you plant them and move the bucket along. Okay, what we need is a trench. It needs to be at least as wide as it's deep. A spade's depth is fine. Make sure the soil is loose, and if it's really compacted, break it up with a fork. So, let's start. You can see that the soil level on this is about where my finger is, so don't plant any deeper. Pop that in there like that. Take the soil and fill in. That's for spacing between the plants. With hawthorn, round about 6 to 8 inches is good. It is really not a good idea to plant them in any kind of dip. They are much more likely to be troubled by being too wet than too dry, even if that seems counterintuitive. Make sure, if anything, it's planted on a slight mound. Bare root plants are often half, if not a third, the price of containerised plants. And remember, the window is from now to the end of February, while they're dormant. Make sure everything is ready before you order the plants. Now, it doesn't really matter what kind of deciduous bare root plant you buy, the same technique applies. But just think about how it's going to look. So if you want a crisp, sort of semi-formal hedge, beech or hornbeam, depending on your soil, will do the job really well. And if you want an informal, wildlife-friendly hedge, then simply order a mixed hedge. Now, obviously, I need to get the rest of these plants in. But while I'm doing that, we're going to join Sue, because this summer she went down to Plymouth to visit a gardener who had made big changes in her garden. But what she'd done was essentially quite simple, although the result was dramatic.
I absolutely love rethinking and redesigning parts of my garden, partly to create more interest and to suit my needs. But it's one thing to do a few borders, it's another thing to completely turn your garden upside down, quite literally, and start again.
Unbelievably, in just 1 year, Caroline Crocker has transformed her back garden into her own floral paradise, complete with a gaggle of ducks.
This is a feast for the eyes. What was it like before?
Well, we've been here 25 years, but up until last year, this was just a sloping lawn.
What inspired you to make the changes?
There's a totally inspirational garden called Wildside, where they took a flat 3-acre field and changed it to 35-metre mounds. And it just opens your eyes to the fact that you can change the landscape and you don't have to just go with what's there.
What did you want to achieve in your own garden?
I wanted to play with that idea of changing the topography, making sure I immerse myself in the plants, and just to have so much more room for plants.
To me, it looks quite a lot of work. Were you worried about that at all?
I was cautious. I've had chronic fatigue for a number of years, and I've always worried a little bit about creating new flower beds. But I think it's just the time has come. You only live once, and there are so many plants I want to grow.
With help from her dad, Caroline stripped away every last inch of turf.
We'd marked out the space initially of where I wanted it to be raised. So that meant as the turf was cut, we were able to put it in the areas that we wanted it to be higher, and then use some of the soil from digging out the paths to go over the top of that.
So you now have your mounds of upside-down turf rotting away. How long did that take?
Well, we left it from the May to the August.
And you've got a lot of paths. How did you actually decide where you're going to put your pathways?
I knew that I wanted paths all around the outside, but then it became apparent that that was going to be very impractical. So we then decided to go through so that we can get from one side to the other without having to go all the way around.
It is a bit like a theatre of flowers, isn't it?
Plants are loving mound life, it turns out. They really are.
Caroline built 4 mounded beds of different heights, ranging from 40 to about 80 centimetres. These allowed for different growing conditions than she would have had if she'd left flat beds. Instead of full sun, plants could be in shade or sun, in drier or damper conditions.
So this is a lower horseshoe-shaped mound, and it dips away, so you've got the slope going down to the front, and it's like a sweet shop mix of all my new favourites, all the peaches and the pinks and the yellows all together.
It's rather bold and beautiful, isn't it? But how did you decide what to put where within the mound structure?
Because it's a south-facing slope and it creates a free draining condition, things like the Erigeron just love that. It's called white Quakeress, and it's an absolute beauty, and you get such a lot of flower from each plant.
Yeah, it really is a profusion of fun, isn't it? And you've got these wonderful grasses bringing movement to the border. I particularly like that one.
That's Ep32, and I love the seed heads. The last few weeks, they're really starting to flop up and catch the light. And the echinacea seem really happy on the top of the mound, where it's lovely and free draining. They've not had wet feet in the winter, and it's certainly the best I've ever grown. So on the inner side, because you've got the mound, you're able to have a different colour scheme on each side. So on the inside, I've tended towards blues and yellows and lilacs, a much cooler feel.
So you're never going to get bored. There's always something interesting to see, isn't it?
Definitely.
At the back of her garden, Caroline has created an 80-centimetre high mound, which is already changing the aspect for the plants growing here.
This is a lovely horseshoe border again, but it's quite different to the other one, isn't it? Because we've got lots of height here and that greater sense of enclosure. Is that what you wanted?
It's a wilder feel as well. And I wanted to pick up on the dark purples and the dark foliage of the border that's always been there behind.
I can see one of my mum's favourite plants there, an abelia.
I love it for cutting from, and I've wanted one forever, so it was going in. But I thought this would be a good place because I've got the height of the mound, then the height of the abelia and the pittosporum.
And it's going to create quite a shady spot on the other side of this border, isn't it?
Yeah, and surprisingly it already has, I think, because that's north facing then. So with the height that they've got to in just a year. So already I've found that I can get away with things like a hardy begonia and a dicentra that both like the shade.
I love the colour scheme in here. It's very, very calming.
I think I'm a bit of a painter stuck inside a gardener. There's not time for everything, so I paint with my plants, and I love picking out the colours of the veins in one thing with the stems of another. It's going to be a changing thing as well. As things get taller, I might need to adapt the planting inside, and that's exciting.
Is it as good as you thought it was going to be?
I've been delighted with the growth for the first year. It's got a feel of how I want it to be already.
I'm in the middle of two symmetrical beds, both about 40 centimetres high, and they're quite narrow. And in order to see through the beds, they've been planted with an airy feel because we want to look up to the rest of the garden. And we've got these lovely mix of wafty see-through plants, like this blue pleurum, which has these little dots of vibrant yellow. What I really love about this border, that you can reach into the centre from either side, so you can maintain it without treading in it, whether you're gardening with your feet or with your hands.
I'm really impressed at Caroline's tenacity in creating a garden this accomplished in just 1 year.
You are driven, aren't you?
And my husband's always said, each time we've taken up more grass in different parts of the garden, he's always said, I can always put the turf back. And I knew each time he said it, there's absolutely no chance once a plant's in.
No.
I just love it.
I think what really impresses me about that is that, although I'm sure it was hard work, what they did was very simple, and yet it created the conditions for what you can see is a very beautiful garden. Now, although you can see the flood behind, it is important when you're planting a hedge to water it. Give it a good soak, and then you don't have to water it again for the rest of winter. The next phase is to mulch it. And mulch it generously, don't skimp on that, particularly for hedges, to keep the weeds down. You do want to get rid of any competing weeds for at least the first 3 years, just to give it a chance to get established. And the last thing I might do is just tip it back by about 1/3, so they're all the same height. And by taking off the leaders, you'll encourage side shoots, which will thicken it up. We're going now to one of your gardens in the East Midlands.
Hi Gardeners World. Welcome to St Andrew's Healthcare. We're a mental health charity based in Northampton. We're lucky to have all these extensive grounds to work in with our learners, growing things like vegetables, perennial plants, shrubs, all sorts of different things that we do. And one of the exciting things we've done this year is to create a tropical garden in a disused polytunnel. This was barren wasteland 5 months ago. and with our learners, volunteers and staff, we've turned this into a beautiful tropical garden. We have some feature plants in here, such as bananas. We have Musabasdew and onsetties. We get these massive leaves that come up in the space of 2 or 3 months that really delight our learners. But what we've tried to do in here is show that you can create a beautiful garden in a very short space of time. So these tropical plants get big very quickly. And then our understory is made up of annuals grown from seed and house plants. So we can show you can garden like this on a very small budget.
At the very start of this project, we asked them to pick the things that they really, really wanted to have in this space. Now, one of the things they all pointed at was a waterfall. So it was up to us to design this mountain. It was made by digging out the foundations into this sort of concrete-like ground, built out of pallets, then filled in with tons of topsoil, then compost, and then tons of stone, and all these beautiful plants. It was a really good learning experience for everyone. They all got to use all the tools to put the structure together, learn about a bit of engineering. So it was absolutely an amazing experience for all concerned. Thank you, Gardeners World!
What an inspired idea to make a waterfall inside a polytunnel. I love that. Now, I've got this big terracotta pot and I've got some tulips. So far, so good. But it is worth pointing out, and you may have noticed it already, that tulips are pretty sparse this year. In fact, it's said to be one of the worst years for tulip bulbs in living memory. And that is because it was so wet last winter. Most tulips come from Holland. In fact, over 90% of them do. And either the bulbs after they were planted were sitting under water for weeks and months, which obviously rotted them and did them no good at all, or because the ground was so wet, they were planted much later than normal, and therefore the bulbs would be smaller and not commercially viable. So what you may find is that tulips are in short supply. So if you haven't got your tulips yet, get on with it. Now, I've got crocks in the bottom, and by the way, it's worth pointing out that November is the month for tulips. You can see that there's a lot of white in this mix. This is perlite, which helps drainage, and I've deliberately chosen that because it's lighter, and this is a big heavy pot. I'm starting with a variety called Apricot Beauty. These, by the way, are destined for the cottage garden where the colour theme is pastels, soft colours. And Apricot Beauty is actually fundamentally a pink tulip flushed with a touch of orange. And I'm going to put 25 in each layer. This is the minimum that I'd put in a pot this size. And as long as they're not touching and you have the bulbs, you can cram them in. Right, that's one layer. You can see they're quite deep because I'm going to do 2 layers, one on top of the other. This is the lasagna technique. I've done it with other bulbs. Right, that's ready for the next layer, which is a tulip called Request, a fundamentally orange tulip that is flushed with pink. There are an awful lot of pink in the plant world, ranging from almost white to almost red, with some very garish options in between. But this is quite subtle. And it's going to work well with the third ingredient that I'm going to add to this pot. So that layer's in there like that. We'll cover that up, ready for the final ingredient, which are here. And these are wallflowers. Wallflowers and tulips are the perfect marriage. They look great together. The wallflowers have some of the best scent of any flower you can ever grow. It's pure honey. This is Sugar Rush Purple Bicolour. I've bought them in pots. You can very often, and if possible, do try and get wallflowers that are bare root. And they are flowering now. Well, wallflowers are supposed to flower in spring. But last year I had wallflowers that started flowering now and kept on flowering till May. And the tulips will come up through and around them and then just fill in. Wallflowers flower best in poor soil. If you give them too much feed, you'll get lots of foliage and not so much flower. Now, the last thing to do is to dress the top with grit. This now should be watered, and then it doesn't need watering again until the tulips start to appear, which may not be until the beginning of March. I like to keep them under cover if possible, but just make sure that it's raised up. So there's a gap between the bottom of the pot and whatever you're standing it on, because otherwise there's a risk to sit in a puddle, and that will harm the bulbs. Now, we're joining a couple in the Scottish borders in Hawick who have a passion for moss.
Moss is magical because it's been with us for such a long time. It can live in all sorts of different environments. Any sort of environment we have on our planet was conquered by moss at some point. It can also transfer us from the macro to the micro world and show us how the small world looks like and how beautiful it can be. My name is Marchant. You can call me Marty, way easier to pronounce. It all started in 2020. We were going around to walks in the woods and we were interested in the small fuzzy little plants that are growing, and all of them look different from each other. So we were reading more and more about it. We got ourselves into biology course to learn even more. We also decided to check online where you can buy moss. We didn't see anybody doing it for the garden scales over here, so we thought that might be something for us because it's very enjoyable to work with mosses. We collect moss mainly from a timber crop. We have a permission from the landowners. We are certified by the Scottish Agricultural Agency. I think every type of moss got a bit of own beauty in it. This particular type of a haircap moss, it developed the primitive root system called rhizoid, and because of that, it allows this moss to stay in the full sun throughout the whole day. You can also see this moss being used in Japanese gardens, and it just looks lovely when you see those massive cushions of the haircap moss growing. Then we have glittering wood, which is one of my personal favorites because of the color. The colors vary from dark green when the moss is kept in the shade, and when you give it a wee bit of sun, it changes the color to this flamey orange. Don't worry, it just looks like it when it's healthy. Another moss that is very interesting for me is, I think, most unpopular moss, which is called springy turf. It loves to grow among grasses, and every time you mow it, you just create more and more moss. Then the moss cuttings are gonna get attached to the lawnmower wheel, and you will just simply spread it around your garden. So when you see this little fella growing in your garden, the best thing to get rid of it, if you want to, is to rake it. After we're going to collect the moss, then we usually clean it up from all the debris. Mainly we then cut the moss and grow it from the cuttings. So we're going to use simple clay soil, clay pebbles. It's also used for bonsai. Initial layer. We're going to give it a wee spray. Now all the clay is going to be nice and wet. Now we're gonna take some moss. What you simply do is cut the moss into tiny, tiny pieces. And the more pieces you'll create, the more moss you'll have. The process takes around 2 weeks from those cuttings. Then they become what is known as moss protonema, which will look like a very green slime. After another 2 weeks, you should see a new growth of moss. So the whole process should take around 4 weeks. From around a square meter of moss, you can create 5 or 10 times the area. We started small. Soon enough, we had inquiries for the gardens and lawns. We're currently in Dawn's and Graham's garden. We're helping them to rejuvenate this area, which at the beginning only had that wee apple tree growing over here and nothing else. So we've planted up headers, We've planted up some ferns and we're gonna lay down the mosses, so 3 simplest plants. The local critters will love the moss over here. The birds will also love it because it will provide them with food, like a buffet for the birds. We've seen heathers, ferns and mosses work very well together in the Scottish Highlands where there is no tree coverage. The only shade the mosses will get is from the ferns or the heathers itself. So they live in a quite symbiotic relationships where the plants are providing mosses with shade, very much needed during summer, and the moss provides the plants with additional humidity. We have a wee bit of a rain over here since it's Scotland, so that will help push down the moss. What you can also do at the very end, if it's dry, you just step on the moss to push it down to the ground and then give it another water. And it should take it around 2 weeks to attach itself to the substrate. Moss is really good for indoor gardening as well. If you don't want to have it in your garden, you can always have it in a wee jar. They are tiny little worlds. And we're going to add some tree moss. And then we can give it a wee bit of nutrients. Moss loves CO2, so whenever we breathe into our mossarium or the terrarium jar, we just give the moss its food. I think a lot of people can find a joy working with moss, whether it's going to be creating a terrarium or display or try to cultivate it in your garden. Even such a small plant can bring so much joy into people's life and can give us a glimpse into the very small world that nobody was even really bothered to look at.
I think mosses are fascinating and beautiful. And I love the tip about breathing into the glass to give it CO2 to feed it. But certainly here at Longmeadow, we have masses of moss because it's so wet. You can see it growing on the brickwork here on the mound. We have it growing on the grass in front of the house, and the birds love it in spring. They're always taking it for their nests. Now, at this time of year, nearly all of us are going to have to deal with fallen leaves in some way or other. As I've often said, I'm a great fan of making leaf mould, and if you can make leaf mould, it makes really good addition to compost and as a mulch in spring. But if you don't have the space or the inclination, what do you do with your leaves? You can add them to the compost heap. That will do no harm at all. Don't add them in great wadges, but in layers mixed up with other compost. You can leave them on grass. If you can see as much or more grass than leaves, leave them. The earthworms will take them into the soil, they'll break down, they'll improve the quality of the soil and therefore the quality of the grass next spring. Or you can use them directly as a mulch. If you've got any shrubs or trees with bare soil around them, put leaves quite thickly around the base, makes a really good mulch, and that will break down and be gone by next spring. So whatever happens, use your leaves in whatever form makes most sense and most relevance to you and your garden. Well, I want to gather as many leaves as I can to use as leaf mould, so there's a lot to do. But while I'm doing this, here are your jobs, not just for this weekend, but for the winter. This is only a small job, but it is important. If you've got any pots planted with bulbs or anything else, raise them up off the ground. You can simply put some chocks, whether homemade or purchased, underneath them, and so they're not sitting on a hard surface which will become a puddle. And this will not only help the plants drain, but also make the pot much less likely to break if there is a hard frost. It's always a good idea to sort out your seeds over winter, before spring. Go through them, checking the dates, and if they're more than 3 years old, I would get rid of them. See if you have too many of anything, and where you're short, obviously make a note and order fresh ones. The idea being is that you have all your seeds ordered, delivered, and sorted before you start sowing next spring. If you have a lawnmower of any kind, give it a once-over before putting it away for the winter. If it's a battery, take the battery out, charge it fully, and keep that separate. Scrape off any accumulated grass clippings and mud, and check the blade. If it's damaged or very blunt, either take it off and sharpen it yourself, or take it to somebody who can do it professionally for you. Give it a good wash and scrub, and then put it away knowing that when the grass starts to grow again, it's ready for action. Well, that's very nearly it for today, which means that's very nearly it for this year, because of course this is the last programme in the series. And looking back over the year, although the weather hasn't been great for us gardeners, I think it's been quite good for the garden. And the changes that we instigated over the last 12 months have, as a result of the weather, I think, come good. The cottage garden, for example, a year ago had diggers in, we dug up hedges and trees, and that meant a real revamp and rethink. And over the winter, I planted lots more roses, and we changed the way that it looked. And I think the cottage garden actually looks better now than it ever has done. The cut flower beds went well. Very simple, just 4 raised beds, lots of drainage, but the cut flowers have been brilliant in there. So all in all, I look back on 2024 as a good gardening year, and I hope it was the same with you. And although this season is coming to an end, we've got 4 special programmes celebrating the year, packed with new material that will be shown throughout November and December.
There are so many exquisite plants at this time of year, and amongst the very best of them are the winter flowering shrubs.
If you had to choose the most important job in the garden, what would it be? What I would say, mulching.
The garden just seems to roll out. It really is a sight to behold.
Welcome to the vegetable patch. This is what I like to think of as my little farm.
And I will be at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh to find out what it takes to maintain one of the world's most diverse collection of plants.
You can see the first of these programmes next Friday at 8 o'clock, and I'll be back with Ned and the rest of the team. So until then, bye-bye.